Evening, everyone, and welcome to the York Festival of Ideas. My name's Juliet Healy, and until recently, I worked at the Bank of England. I'm now a non-executive director for a number of organisations. I'm going to be chairing the event this evening. Thank you for joining us. It's my great pleasure to welcome you all here. So it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker this evening, Martin Slater. For over 30 years, Martin was an economics fellow at St Edmund Hall at the University of Oxford. He's also served as Oxford's economics sub-faculty chair and as managing editor of Oxford Economic Papers. He's principally an industrial economist, but his interest in the peculiarities of national debt has led to an excellent book, which is the subject of this evening's talk. He's going to talk about the national debt and its role in shaping the course of British history. And with Rachel Reeves presenting her first multi-year spending review assessment next week, and all the commentary about difficult choices between spending and tax, it's hard to think of a more timely opportunity to understand how we got to where we are today. So, Martin, over to you.
Well, okay, let's see if this works. Well, if everybody can hear me, welcome. I'm very pleased to be here. I think 35 minutes, so let us start straight away. And let us start with the bad news. If you can see the screen in front of you, 2.8 trillion pounds. That's the current level of the UK government's national debt. That's about 99% of GDP, a measure of national income. Alternatively, it's £41,000 per person. And it's been rapidly rising. In fact, it's quintupled since 2007. Wow. Okay. But that's a rather short space of time. What I'm quite interested in is the very long-term history of the national debt. And so let's look at a very long-run graph of the national debt, all the way back to about 1690, which is normally the date that people take the modern national debt to start from. And you can see that this graph looks pretty dire as well. It's a really big, explosive thing. But this is misleading because practically every economic aggregate, if you graph it over this very long time scale, looks like that because the economy itself has grown over time and everything grows with it. So let's try and look at a way of dealing with that. And let's look at the size of the national debt relative to the GDP, relative to national income in each year. And here we find a really very interesting picture, very different from the first picture. We find not just a single explosive growth, but we find really quite big ups and downs. And you can see really there are two very large peaks. Very slow rise to begin with, over about a whole century to a big peak, another fall for another century, and then more rise to peaks. What is actually going on here? Well, basically, this is a story of war and peace. The 18th century, which is that first jagged rise, was a century of almost continual wars, mostly with France. There were one war followed another. There was a little period of peace, then another and another and another. And you can see the national debt rises in this jagged way until it reaches a peak in about 1815, obviously, with the Battle of Waterloo. And then the 19th century is totally different because for Britain, at least, the 19th century was a century of relative peace. And this national debt GDP ratio falls pretty steadily all through the century, right until 1914. So having started about 200% of GDP, it's down to about 25 just before the First World War. And then, of course, unfortunately, the two world wars come along, and you can see their peaks on the right. And that peak ends in 1945, even higher, almost like 250% of GDP. And then follows another sharp decline, right the way back to 25% again. And then it bobbles around a bit. And then we see a small uptick on the very far right of the graph. And that small uptick is the figures that I showed you in the first slide. And perhaps the interesting thing about that is, although those figures look very alarming, in the context of this graph, it's nothing terribly big. The peak we've got there is about only half of those large peaks of the past. The other very important thing about this graph is, why is the national debt GDP ratio falling in those periods when it falls? And the answer is, it's not because the government is repaying the national debt. In fact, the UK government has been very bad at actually repaying the national debt. What is happening in those periods is not that the debt is falling, but the GDP is rising. The real thing that gets you out of these debt peaks is the growth of the economy, rather steady growth of the economy over a long period of time. And that's what is actually driving the shape of this graph. And my book was really all about sort of trying to understand what exactly is going on in all these ups and downs. You know, what is the context of the time? What are the policies of the time? What are the personalities who are involved in it? So let's go on a bit, and particularly let's go and let's talk now about that uptick that we're living through at the moment, right on the far right of that graph. What's actually happening there is really rather different, because as I said, most of that graph is about war and peace. This little uptick we're living in at the moment is not about war, well, at least not yet. It's really about a whole series of very unusual peacetime shocks. And you see on the table here, starting off with the financial crisis of 2008, we were just getting over that, and then we were hit by a whole series of things that are quite unusual. Brexit, COVID, totally unprecedented, complete cessation of economic activity, required massive subsidies through things like the furlough scheme and subsidies to business to stop everything going bankrupt. This was then followed by inflation, partly supply bottlenecks post-COVID, and partly the Ukraine war and the cost of petrol and oil and gas. Then an unfortunate thing happened. One of the things that cushioned the national debt after the financial crisis of 2008, interest rates were being held very low by central banks around the world. So that although the national debt itself went up, strangely, the interest cost of national debt went down during the early period. But that period came to an end. The American central bank began to raise interest rates very sharply, and that increased the cost of the national debt to the UK. Then we had another episode. Of course, the Truss government had a very sort of torrid time, and that caused problems for the national debt. And now, of course, we have the uncertainty of the Trump administration, and that is very bad for things like the national debt, principally because we just don't know what's going to happen from day to day. Now, those problems are all in the nature of spikes, and that are things that is quite good for the national debt to deal with, because they come to an end and we start paying off. But we also have some very long-term challenges, which are really going to be permanent problems: aging, health and social care, climate change. With the new government, there's new focus on the poor quality of public infrastructure and services after a long period of austerity. And now, of course, we have another surprise. We find we really have to confront a very large increase in defence expenditure, even possibly the eventuality of another major war, which of course would change the picture enormously. So altogether, these things have made the Office of Budget Responsibility, who are responsible for monitoring the long-term future of the national debt, suggest that we're really on track. At least in the next 50 years, we might actually reach something like 350% of GDP, well above those peaks that you saw in my graph. But that's a projection, not a forecast. What it really means is we have to take some very serious decisions, particularly about these very long-term challenges, very soon. When I first wrote my book, it seemed to me we had quite a lot of time to take those decisions. All these procession of nasty shocks in the recent years mean that time window for taking these serious decisions has narrowed considerably, and we really need to get our act together and decide what exactly we are going to do about aging, health, social care, climate change, etc. And unless we do that, then we will actually find the national debt continues to climb for a long period of time. And as we've seen, once the national debt begins to climb, it does tend to climb for a long period of time before you get a turnover at the top. Okay, so that's some of the rather grim numbers that we have to confront with. Maybe they're grim, but maybe there's also light that we can say. There's no particular reason to despair. What you can see that history tells us, we have actually grown out of previous large debt peaks. So there are things we can do about it if we actually get our act together. But I'd like to sort of carry on by perhaps talking a bit about more of the human side of national debt. And the way I'd like to do that is perhaps to show you some rather unlikely pairings and wonder why I actually bring these things together. Well, let's start with these two photographs. What do you think links these two photographs? One pile of rather scruffy sticks and Big Ben. Well, the pile of scruffy sticks are in fact tallies, and they are the way the national debt was accounted for in the Middle Ages. Before we had paper bonds, we had wooden receipts. If you lent money to the government, or particularly if you supplied goods to the government, they wouldn't pay you in cash. They'd give you one of these sticks, which is a receipt. And these sticks were notched crosswise. You can see the bottom one, you can actually see the notches. And they were then split down the middle. One half was kept by the government and the other half was given to the creditor. And when the debt was eventually repaid, the two halves would be matched to verify the claim. Now, that was a very good system in a way. It was very difficult to forge because the grain of wood is just as distinctive as fingerprints. There's absolutely no way you can forge them. But they were very cumbersome, and obviously by about 1700 they were superseded by paper. But the government continued to cut them as a sort of reserve database for the national debt, and so they're kept stored in cellars in the Palace of Westminster for another couple of hundred years until about 1830. The government really decided to get rid of them, phase them out completely. So what should we do with the stock of wood? Well, let's just burn it. Bad idea. That's what happened. This is the Great Parliament Fire of 1834. They burnt the tallies and something went wrong, and House of Commons, House of Lords all went burnt to the ground. The only thing that was saved was Westminster Hall. And that's why we have the nice new Houses of Parliament that we all know and love. It's because the Tallies burnt the government down. Right, another couple of tags. What have these two people got together? Well, you know Gordon Brown, of course. Who is the gentleman in the wig? That's Robert Walpole, often thought of as the first really official prime minister of the UK in the 1720s. What links them? Well, both of them cemented their reputation by solving financial crises. You remember that Gordon Brown eventually solved the 2008 financial crisis by nationalising the banks effectively. Although very tactfully, he didn't mention the word nationalisation, which of course was taboo at the time. Robert Walpole cemented his reputation by clearing up the mess after the South Sea bubble. Now, you probably know about the South Sea bubble, which is the first big stock market hysteria, boom and bust in Britain, has a long history. What you probably don't realize about the South Sea bubble was that what was really driving it was a concern about the national debt. The government was just beginning to amass quite large and expensive debts, and it saw an opportunity here to get rid of these debts by essentially encouraging the debt holders to change their national debt into the equity shares of this new South Sea company. Why would they do that? Well, only if they thought that the South Sea Company was going to be a gold mine. So the government really set about talking up the prospects of the South Sea Company and fueled this boom. And when eventually it collapsed, well, Walpole cleared up the mess. He was given a lot of credit for that until some rather small-minded people said, hey, but didn't you instigate it all in the first place? Which is perfectly true. And actually the same sort of thing was said about Gordon Brown. Yeah, okay, you solved the problem, but weren't you the Chancellor of the Exchequer in the years leading up to the financial crisis? So maybe 2 cheers for Walpole and Gordon Brown. Here we see actually a South Sea Company share. The South Sea Company didn't actually disappear, but it got transformed into a very sedate, almost savings bank. And for about 100 years later, the middle classes held their savings in these things called South Sea annuities. One of the people who held them was Jane Austen. All right, here's another couple. Well, again, you'll recognize George Osborne. The man on the left isn't Robert Walpole again, but he looks fairly similar because he was Robert Walpole's successor, and his name was Henry Pelham. And he was prime minister about 1740s. And he has a great claim, essentially, to be thought of as the father of the modern public debt system, because what he did was he invented a thing called the consol, the government bond. He took the opportunity of one of the rare intervals of peace in the 1740s, where market interest rates went very low, to consolidate what was a chaotic ragbag of government debts, all sorts of kinds, short-term, long-term. Some of them were actually life annuities, others were lotteries. It was all a real mess and also very expensive to the government. But he persuaded and he cajoled and he coerced all the holders to transfer all their holdings into one single new government security, the 3% consolidated stock, consols in colloquial terms. And this was a wonderful innovation. 3 things about the consols. One, they were very simple compared to what would happen before. Very transparent. Everybody could see exactly the government's position and their own position. Secondly, they were very modest expense to the government. 3% was a low interest rate compared to what they'd done before. So it's a very good deal for the government. And thirdly, and this is what might surprise you, the government had no legal liability to repay them. ever. So if you put £100 into these consols, what you got was £3 interest a year forever. But you would never see your £100 again. Why on earth, you probably ask, did the investors tolerate this? Two reasons, really. One was, by this time, the investors didn't really want their money back. What they wanted was a very long-term, very secure home for their savings and a very predictable, very secure, continuous income flow. And that's exactly what consols did for them. And the other thing was that if they did want their money back, well, the government wasn't going to give the money back. But by now, a good second-hand market in these bonds had emerged. So you could simply sell your console to somebody else. And that's what we now call the bond markets. Basically, they are second-hand markets for government bonds. So that was Pelham's great claim to fame. And these were an amazing success. They became the mainstay of government public finance for the next 150 years. Almost every borrowing after Pelham was in consols. The whole national debt became practically consols all the way up to 1914. Again, the middle classes loved them. They all held their savings in consols. And if you read 19th century literature, you see they're riddled with references to consols. So where does George Osborne fit into this? Well, as I say, consols ruled the roost until 1914. But after 1914, they lost favor because consols, by their structure, were very vulnerable to inflation. That didn't matter in the 18th and 19th century because there was very little inflation then. But in the 20th century, there was. Consols holders made big losses and didn't really want to go on holding them. So after 1914, very few consols and similar securities were issued. Almost everything since 1914 has had a legal liability to repay at a particular time. But the existing consols stuck around. Well, of course they stuck around because the government had no liability to repay, so there was nowhere for them to go. So they existed for another 100 years as second-hand bonds. But increasingly, as inflation proceeded and enormous new bond issues proceeded, they became proportionately a smaller and smaller total of the national debt. So by about 2000, the year 2000, they were really only kind of the petty cash of the national debt. They were hardly worth the administrative costs of keeping them going. So in 2015, George Osborne took the opportunity of repaying them. He wasn't legally required to repay them, but he had the opportunity to. So he repaid them and abolished them and some other old securities at the same time. And this allowed the government to have a great PR splurge, where they said, well, now we have finally repaid all the debts of the Napoleonic Wars and of World War I and of World War II. It really sounded a very grand gesture. But actually, as I said, this was really petty cash. It was tiny compared to the total national debt and made no difference at all, really, to the total debt. But that was the end of the consols after about 150 years. One of the really iconic government bonds. Here, well, this looks like a console. Actually, it isn't a console. It couldn't be a console because consoles never had any physical existence. Consoles were simply entries in the Bank of England register. This is actually a certificate, which is a proof of purchase for the purchaser of a console, and enable him to prove his ownership in the time before the Bank of England clerks got round to updating the register, which they only did at intervals. But as you can see, this is consolidated 3% annuities, and that's what people did. Now, how are we doing for time? Okay, another pair. This time they've both got wigs, right? On the right, William Pitt, the younger, Prime Minister at the time of the Napoleonic Wars. You've probably heard, you know about him. On the left, a chap you probably don't know about. He was the Reverend Richard Price, and he was a radical, nonconformist clergyman who spewed out a whole torrent of explosive sermons and pamphlets of a revolutionary nature. And one of his great coups was when the French revolutionary government guillotined the king and Marie Antoinette, he published an open letter of congratulation to the French government for doing this. And this so incensed the conservative politician Edmund Burke that he sat down and wrote his famous book, Reflections on the Recent Revolutions in France. And this so incensed Tom Paine that he sat down and wrote The Rights of Man. And this so incensed Mary Wollstonecraft that she sat down and wrote A Vindication of the Rights of Woman. So, if nothing else, he was a great stirrer. But he was also, surprisingly, a serious mathematician and a serious statistician. He was a fellow of the Royal Society, and he edited the works of the great statistician Thomas Bayes, and he advised insurance companies on actuarial matters. But he also had an obsession about the national debt, and he had a wizard wheeze which he claimed would solve the problems of the national debt almost painlessly. And he put this to Pitt. And Pitt, who was at the time obviously waging a very expensive and almost interminable war against Napoleon, and as you've seen from my first slide, the national debt had already risen to a real peak, was desperate for a way out of the national debt. So the two got together and they put together a plan which was called the sinking fund. Actually, sinking fund is a generic term, but this was the sinking fund. Two very bizarre things about this. One, it's incredible to think that two people of such opposed political persuasions could get together to put a plan. This is rather like Bernie Sanders advising Trump on tariff policy. The other bizarre thing about it was that the scheme didn't actually work, although it really fooled the public for a long time in the Napoleonic Wars. But at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, the public finally realized that actually the national debt hadn't been repaid. It was actually bigger still. And there was immense revulsion about that. This is the great political cartoonist Gilray, who was a prolific cartoonist and scaler of political corruption at the time. And he was terribly interested in the national debt. He wrote several cartoons on this. This is one of his best. Here we see John Bull, the British working man, crushed by the weight of the national debt. This little leprechaun at the top is the Chancellor of the Exchequer, and he's shoveling out largesse to all the people on the bottom. And all these people are recognizable caricatures of the major politicians of the time. So this is a scathing indictment of the corruption of the national debt and how it's all put on the back of the poor. So that was the national debt. Right. Well, we're nearly at the present day, as you can see. Well, I'm not going to say very much about Liz Truss. You know all about Liz Truss. The really interesting person in this couple of slides is the man, whom I guess probably many of you will not recognize. And I think that's a great shame, because his story is, in my view, incredibly important for our current predicaments. He is Philip Snowden, and he was the very first Labour Chancellor of the Exchequer in 1920s. And the very first Labour government came to power in somewhat similar circumstances to the current circumstances. The public finances were in a terrible state because this was just after the First World War. The First World War had seen an explosion of the national debt. The national debt was at levels that people thought were astronomical and intolerable and didn't know what to do about it. But on the other hand, the country was beginning to see the emergence of a terrible problem of mass unemployment. And there were great expectations that the new Labour government was going to do something about that. But as we all know, every incoming Labour government and every new Labour Chancellor of the Exchequer has first of all to prove to the public, to the markets, to the electorate, to the press, that they are fiscally responsible. And you can imagine how big this pressure was for the very first Labour Chancellor of the Exchequer. But Mr. Snowden was more than up to the task, fortunately, or for the country, unfortunately. He proved to be the most fiscally conservative Chancellor of the Exchequer, I think, of all time. At a time when the economy was crying out for reflationary policy, he insisted not on just on balancing the budget, but on more than balancing the budget. So there was a big surplus so he could start repaying off all these First World War debts. He vetoed all his colleagues' proposals to spend money on doing anything about unemployment. The result was that very quickly the government became very unpopular. The ministers got frustrated, and in the end, the cabinet split, the government fell, all the other Labour ministers resigned. It left just Snowden and the Prime Minister, Ramsay MacDonald, and they invited the Conservatives to join in a coalition government, which was in fact dominated by the Conservatives, who soon got rid of Snowden and Ramsay MacDonald, and the Conservatives were in power for the next 15 years. So what have we got? We have on the right-hand side, possibly the most reckless fiscally Prime Minister of modern times, and on the left, of probably the most fiscally conservative Chancellor of the Exchequer ever. And what did the fiscal, and both of them got burnt. As we know, Liz Truss went too far, too fast, and got burnt by the financial markets. Snowden, he wanted to retrench too much. He really didn't want to do anything. And the result was, as I say, he essentially collapsed his government and caused the country to have great difficulties in dealing with the Great Depression. So where do we end up with? Well, perhaps we end up here. So we have a new Chancellor of the Exchequer, and I like to think the Chancellor of the Exchequer has two ghosts sitting on her shoulders. To the right, we have fiscal recklessness. To the left, overcaution. And her unenviable job is actually to steer some course between them. And I don't think the government, she and the government in general, have quite made up their mind how they're going to do this. We might find out a bit more next week in the spending review, but I think the country really needs to know, just what kind of credible plan have we got to steer our way between Scylla on the one side and Charybdis on the other. Okay, thank you for the moment. Bye.
Martin, thank you very much indeed. And now we have some time for questions. So thank you very much to everybody who's posted. There are some that kind of are around different themes. So So I thought maybe we could start with the questions that are about countries. So Martin, the first questions for you are, do any countries not have national debt? And then sort of slightly related to that, there's also a question about countries holding each other's debt, and could it not be simply cancelled out? So, obviously this person asking the question understands that the debt might be held by different instruments, so gilt or treasuries or whatever, but could we not kind of net out cross-country debt?
Yes,
That's
right.
a little
Well,
starter for you.
so okay, some countries. Well, almost all countries do have a national debt, although some it's really only a nominal one. Some very favoured countries actually don't have a national debt. They really have a national surplus. Particularly the oil-producing countries. Norway has a little national debt, but actually it has an enormous sovereign wealth fund, which is the opposite of a national debt, and the net effect is positive. Countries like Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, similarly, have enormous sovereign wealth funds, so they actually have positive credit balances, not a negative debt. So that's the first the answer first. Some almost everybody has a national debt of some kind, but some are bigger than others, and we are one of the biggest ones, obviously. All right. Well, the other thing, well, can a lot of it be netted out? Well, a lot of people have suggested this. In fact, there was a very early French economist in the 18th century said, well, the national debt is really just like the right hand pays the left hand. We're just, we are paying taxes to make repayments of the national debt, which actually, in the end, quite a lot of them come back to us, because who holds the national debt? It's people like pension funds, and they pay our pensions. So there is a certain amount of merry-go-round going on in this. The other quite odd thing that happens is that quite a lot of the national debt, strangely, is held by government departments. The government departments have to have reserves, just like banks do, because some of them have big spending things, and they hold their reserves in government debt. And I read somewhere rather recently that quite a lot of the American national debt is actually held by various federal agencies. Now, given Mr. Trump's proclivities for closing down federal agencies, this might suggest he does actually have an opportunity of this kind just to cancel the thing out. Well, although my guess he won't do that. He'll use the fiscal leeway to cut taxes and say that he still has a national debt. But yes, to a certain extent, you can net off, but not entirely. For instance, it used to be the case that most of the British national debt was held by British individuals and British organizations. This is not so true now. It's about 30% of it is actually held by foreigners. And that causes a little bit of a problem. One of the things that does mean is that the interest payments now, instead of really being just a redistribution of money within the UK, now some of it is definitely a net drain on the UK. The other problem is that the foreign holders of the national debt are a little more volatile than the domestic ones. The domestic pension funds know they have to stick with the British national debt because they have liabilities in sterling that they can't hedge against in that kind of way. But I think the fact that we've got rather more volatile foreign holders is probably contributed to the Truss crisis. Why, when things began to go wrong for Liz Truss, they went wrong very quickly, was because these foreign holders of national debt really took fright. And if you're a foreign holder of national debt, you have lots of alternatives. You can go to Germany, Japan, USA. You can do bonds, equities, real estate. You don't have to stick with the British national debt. and therefore, life has become a bit more volatile for the debt because of that.
Thank you. So, a sort of taking us in a definitional direction, somebody's asked about whether the UK obsesses too much about national debt, and are we worrying about the wrong indicator of the health of our economy?
Well, of course, you know, the national debt, and I say this about the national debt has been with us for hundreds of years. Most people, of course, are totally oblivious of it, and they don't know about it. They don't need to know about it, and it hasn't really affected them. It's not the same as private debts. Your private debts. Well, you really know you've got to pay your credit card and your mortgage, or nasty things happen to you. For most of the national debt history, despite some really climactic times, world wars, depressions, and things like that. And you see these big swings in the actual value of the national debt. We haven't actually had, a meltdown of the national debt at all. So, yes, there is a view that well, you can obsess too much about this thing. The problem with debt is that, of course, debt is very much a balancing act. Ideally, we don't want to be very in debt. On the other hand, we all know in our own lives, there are times when we think it's a jolly good thing to be in debt. We buy houses on mortgages, and we think if we couldn't do that, we'd be worse off, not better off. So yes, the problem is, how do you actually work this balancing act? You see, between, as I say, between kind of the trust side of the spectrum and the Snowden side of the spectrum. My graph, as you saw, shows that the level of national debt is not actually anything like as high as previous peaks in our history. Our problem, though, of course, is, well, can we guarantee to repeat that history? Life has changed a lot. What we're seeing now is not so much kind of a war, a peace kind of thing. All these are sort of rather peacetime thoughts. Our history suggests that the national debt shouldn't be rising like this in peacetime. So this is perhaps a bit more alarming than the figures suggest. So I always have to give a rather ambivalent answer. Certainly you should not be complacent about debt, but I still think even with the numbers we've got, this is not the time to panic about debt. We do have time to sort out the problems, and history tells us there are ways we can sort these problems out.
Yeah. There are quite a few questions here, and I'm kind of looking at the time. So there are some that we will come back to if we've got time. But I thought if we could answer a couple of questions people have asked about, the trust budget. Was it really so bad? So one person says the interest rates, it was forecast to cause by the OBR or the BOE. They couldn't remember which organisation had forecast the interest rates, were exceeded by the Sunak government, and the forecast pension fund crash was actually a boom, resulting in a surplus the current government plans to use as investment in government approved projects. So that's one question on the trust budget. Was it really so bad? There's another one that I'm just going to try and find. Where is it? I think it was about how bad was the trust event in the context of 300 years of history of national debt.
Right. Yes. Well, yes. I mean, was the trust budget so bad? Well, perhaps in the numbers, not so bad. It was a combination. There were a combination of factors. You see, what people focus on was, of course, that the mini budget, where taxes were cut, and there wasn't a plan to sort of fund the shortfall in national revenue that they would cut. Now, of course, Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng would say, but that's the whole point of our plan. What we were wanting to do was to cut taxes and that would generate growth, and eventually the tax revenues of this higher levels of economic activity would would replace the tax revenues we've lost. So in the long run, we would have been all right. But obviously, inevitably, in the short run, there was a gap, and the people had to fill that. But the other things that were going on were a lot of kind of contextual problems. In terms of frightening the market, it's quite often not simply the numbers that frighten them, but the kind of ways in which you actually approach it. And two very important things happened as well as the mini budget. One was that the government sacked the chief civil servant of the Treasury, a man who was very well respected, and he was sacked immediately. The Truss government took office. And the other thing was that the Office of Budget Responsibility, which is the sort of semi-autonomous body which is entrusted with monitoring the long-term development of the national debt, and the convention has arisen that the OBR always gets a chance to comment on the budget and put out a report saying whether it thinks it is sustainable or not. And the Truss government made it clear that they were in a hurry and they were quite willing to go ahead without the OBR. And I think personally that was the thing that really frightened the markets. There have been giveaway budgets before. For instance, Nigel Lawson cut taxes very heavily in the Thatcher years. He got away with it. Why did he get away with it? Well, because actually the markets thought this was a good thing to do, and that they were on song with that, and they believed in Mrs. Thatcher's plan. I think the Truss government was in such a hurry that although it said it had a plan, it seemed to be a fairly sketchy plan, and we never really got, because the government didn't last very long, we never really got to see what it was in detail. But I think the markets felt it was probably a bit sketchy, and they weren't willing to give her the benefit of the doubt. Well, yes, also lots of other things were happening at the same time, as your other question said. Well, interest rates rose sharply because of the Truss budget, but also interest rates were going up anyway, and so it is quite difficult to disentangle what was the effect of the background rise in interest rates and what was the effect of the mini budget. But again, the context and the way in which you kind of present policies gets very important. If you want to introduce a policy that you think is is bound to raise interest rates a bit, it's not a good time to do it when interest rates are already going up. You really want to groom the market in advance. So I was saying earlier, you see, Henry Pelham back in the 18th century, he was able to pull off his coup about bringing the rates of interest down because he chose his moment well when the market rates of interest were very low. So he could do it at that time. He wouldn't have been able to do it. In fact, his predecessor Walpole sort of tried to do a bit of that earlier, but the interest rates situation wasn't favorable, and so he kind of pulled back from it. So numbers are important, but also the context and the degree of confidence. Going back to what really confronts Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer is they've got to put together what appears to be a comprehensive and credible strategy for dealing with this problem. What I think worries me so far about the current government is that the measures seem to come out in a sort of drib-drab, one after the other, almost in as a reaction to events. It's almost as if, last month's borrowing figures were a bit bad. We must cut something else. Let's cut winter fuel payments. Now, I think you might get away with cutting winter fuel payments with the electorate if it was presented as really a part of a comprehensive plan that is going to sort this issue out. But if it just appeers to be, we've got to save some money, then you get the reaction that they did get, which is, oh, well, but this just looks like austerity under another name. So I think that it's very important when you're dealing with the markets to actually have a very good, sound narrative behind you. And that's what we're kind of still, I think, struggling to find.
Sorry, thank you. I'm going to try and squeeze in two more questions before we have to close. I quite like this question. Do we really need a central bank? We survived without it until 1694, and the USA survived until the early 20th century.
Well, of course, we didn't have a bank before 1694, but then we didn't have paper money. We used things like gold and silver. These are very inconvenient. What we've got now is a highly sophisticated, very complicated virtual monetary system. And you can't really operate that without having some kind of central regulator holding the reins. The evidence always suggests that if you lose that central control in a kind of paper or electronic money set up, things go wrong very quickly. So yeah, I think we do have a central bank. Interesting. The Federal Reserve System is quite politically controversial in the States, of course. The Americans, of course, didn't have a national debt either until they were independent, and until a little bit after that, actually. And it was only Alexander Hamilton, you see, he of the musical fame, you see, who created the American national debt. Because what happened there was the American War of Independence was essentially waged by the separate American states. And they all chipped in, and they all had their own individual national debts, state debts, at the end of the war. And of course, the big political problem in America is to what extent is the federal government going to have power over the states, or should the states really have power over their own jurisdictions? And Alexander Hamilton, because of his experience in the war, felt that this kind of diffused state-led finance caused big problems in the financing of the war. He was very much in favor of, again, like Pelham, consolidating these debts into one federal debt. Whereas other people thought, oh no, we want to maintain state independence. And very interesting, you see, this whole kind of state versus federal friction still exists today. It went through the Civil War. That was all about it. It's what Trump supporters are still fighting, these kind of battles between the federal power, and you can see that Trump and his friends really want to dismantle federal power and give the power back to the states. So yeah, you could. And the same thing goes for the central bank, which is the central bank in America is a slight compromise, because it's actually not one bank, it's a network of reserve banks, the Federal Reserve network. So, there are about a dozen sub-departments of the Federal Reserve. But yes, you can see that people like Mr. Trump and Mr. Musk would actually like to get rid of the Federal Reserve and do without it. And there are some people who think, yeah, well, that's fine. Money can be independently managed. Well, I think history tells you that's quite difficult, although theoretically, yeah, it's a possibility.
And one final question, which I don't think is answered in your book, so I've picked this one. What is the most misleading message that you hear from political spokespeople in the media about the UK national debt?
Well,
that may be tricky to choose one.
Well, I don't like the most misleading. The one I actually quite like goes back to Theresa May. You remember Theresa May had a catchphrase, there is no magical money tree. You remember that one? No magic money tree. And I always thought, well, that's obviously wrong. You see? And everybody knows it's wrong. There is a magic money tree. It's the Bank of England. The Bank of England can create as much money as it likes. It doesn't like, but it could if it wanted. The point is not the problem is that the money tree analogy is very misleading. What she should have said is there is no magic real resources tree. That's not so catchy. But you know, the Bank of England could create as much money as it likes. And we may say to ourselves, well, the problem with the National Health Service is it hasn't got enough money. Well, we could give it as much money as it liked. But money itself doesn't save lives. It only works if we can use that money to train up new doctors, new nurses, build new hospitals. It's the real resources that that are required. And there we do have a problem. And I think, you see, this government has quite a lot of problems. It keeps on firing out sort of plans for, well, it's going to do this, it's going to build so many houses here, it's going to up the defense budget by so many %, it's going to build tram networks there, it's going to employ more doctors and more healthcare workers. I wonder, where are all these people going to come from? You know, we already have a problem of labor shortage. You know, we could create all the money necessary for this, but where are these people going to come from? Well, we know where in practice in the past they come from, and that's migration. That's not terribly popular at the moment. So, you know, what we're going to find, you know, if the government really gets going, is that they're going to have really a kind of shortage of real resources to deliver all their promises. And that tends to, well, where does that lead us? Well, we all know as economists where that leads us. That leads us to inflation, because we can create as much money as we like, but if there aren't the raw material to make trainee doctors and nurses, then that's just going to raise the prices of doctors and nurses, and we're not going to get a real improvement. So, you know, that again is another area where we really need a concerted statement of, you know, exactly how the government is going to do this. How is it going to prioritize getting all the real resources done? So, yeah, I think the problem at the national debt is all about money claims. And the money claims are very important. But in the end, you know, what we want is real things. And it's what goes wrong with the national debt and with public debt is that there gets to be a mismatch between the financial claims that the national debt and bonds and things seem to give us and our ability actually to put that into real resources.
Martin, thank you so much. Thank you so much for that wonderful talk, and also being so open and fulsome in your responses to the questions. Thank you, everybody, for all your questions. I'm sorry we didn't get through every one of them. Some of them, particularly the definitional ones, and the debate around measures and so on, they are in the book. So if you'd like to buy the book, you will get the answers to some of those questions.
That's true. Yes. Thank you.
So thank you for attending today's event. And obviously, if you'd like to purchase a copy of Martin's book, The National Debt, A Short History, it'll be available from the partner bookseller, Fox Lane Books, that I think you've already seen a slide for. So once again, thank you very much to Martin. Thank you very much to the audience. And thank you very much to the background team that made all of this possible. Good night.
Thank you for listening.